Okay, so imagine this, right? You're deep in a dungeon, decked out in full plate armor, wielding a legendary sword, and all of a sudden you come face to face with a creature that can completely nullify all that gear.
Oof, that's a scary thought.
Right. It makes you realize that maybe, just maybe, we rely a little too much on those classic, tried and true D&D monsters.
Yeah, dragons, beholders, goblins, they're all fun and challenging in their own right. But sometimes you need something a little more unexpected to really shake things up.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, those often overlooked creatures that can turn a typical dungeon crawl into a truly memorable experience.
The unsung heroes of the Monster Manual, those are the ones that really get my gears turning as a DM.
Me too. And speaking of memorable encounters, I had one in my last tabletop session that really got me thinking about this whole concept of underrated monsters. We were exploring this abandoned dwarven mine, expecting the usual suspects like goblins or maybe a giant spider or two.
Classic dungeon fare.
Exactly. But we were so focused on finding this lost artifact that we completely overlooked the seemingly harmless patches of moss growing along the walls.
Uh-oh, I have a feeling I know where this is going.
You got it. It turns out we had stumbled upon a colony of yellow mold, and let me tell you, those things are not as passive as they sound.
No, yellow mold can be incredibly dangerous, especially for a party that's not expecting it. I mean, those spores can incapacitate even the toughest warrior.
Yeah, and they did. Half our party was down before we even realized what was happening. It was a chaotic scramble to get out of there alive, and let's just say we'll never look at moss the same way again.
See, that's a perfect example of why I love using these less common creatures. They keep the players on their toes, force them to think creatively, and make every encounter feel truly unique.
Absolutely. It's all about adding that element of surprise. And that brings us to the article we're exploring today from LitRPG Reads, The 7 Most Terrifying, Underrated D&D Monsters.
This article is a goldmine of ideas for any dungeon master looking to spice up their campaigns.
For real. So let's jump right in. The article starts with a creature that can give even the most heavily armored paladin nightmares, the Rust Monster.
Ah, yes, the Rust Monster. I love these guys. They're not physically imposing, but their ability to corrode metal can completely change the dynamic of a battle.
Right. Imagine your fighter, all decked out in their shiny plate armor and magical sword, suddenly facing a creature that can turn all that gear into useless junk.
It's a humbling experience, to say the least. It forces the players to rethink their tactics and consider alternative approaches.
Maybe they have to rely on spells that don't involve metal components. Or maybe they have to get creative with their environment, using traps or natural obstacles to their advantage.
Exactly. It's all about adaptation and thinking outside the box.
Speaking of thinking outside the box, let's move on to a creature that embodies chaos and speed, the Quickling.
Ah, the Quickling, those little bundles of energy. Their speed and unpredictability can make them a real challenge for players who rely on reaction time or carefully laid plans.
It's like trying to hit a target that's constantly teleporting around the battlefield.
Exactly. And because they're fey creatures, they often have their own unique motivations, which might not always align with the player's goals.
So you never quite know what you're going to get with a Quickling, which makes them a really fun creature to incorporate into a campaign.
Absolutely. They can be used for anything from mischief and pranks to serious threats, depending on how you want to play them.
Now, if we're talking about creatures with complex motivations, we have to mention the Revenant. These undead beings are driven by a single, all-consuming desire, vengeance.
Revenants are fascinating to me because they're not just mindless monsters to be slain. They have a story, a purpose, and potentially even a path to redemption.
So encountering a Revenant could be more than just a combat encounter. It could be a chance for the players to delve into the Revenant's backstory, understand its motivations, and maybe even help it find peace.
It's a great opportunity for role-playing and exploring themes of justice, revenge, and the nature of the soul.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about a creature that's both physically imposing and psychologically terrifying, the Chain Devil.
Ah, yes. The Chain Devil, or Kyton, as they're also known. These fiends are all about control and torment, and their mastery of chains is both impressive and unsettling.
Just the image of a chain devil with its glowing eyes and those wicked barbs on its chains is enough to send shivers down your spine.
Absolutely, and the way they use those chains, it's not just about brute force, it's about manipulation, about turning the environment itself into a weapon.
It's the kind of encounter that can really mess with the players' heads, make them feel trapped and helpless.
And from the depths of those chains, we ascend to the ancient and enigmatic, the Aboleth.
Aboleths are a whole other level of creepy. They're these ancient psionic creatures that can enslave minds and manipulate reality itself.
They operate on a scale that's almost Lovecraftian, and their goals are often far-reaching and terrifying.
Imagine a coastal town under the subtle control of an Aboleth, its citizens unknowingly carrying out its will.
The players might not even realize they're dealing with an Aboleth until it's too late.
That's a level of mind-bending manipulation that could really keep a campaign interesting.
And from manipulation, we descend into pure chaos with the Slaad.
Slaad, those unpredictable creatures from the plane of limbo. You never quite know what you're going to get when facing them.
Right. They could be disease-ridden red Slaad one moment and cunning death Slaad the next, each with their own unique abilities and agendas.
And their connection to limbo means that anything is possible. Portals could open and close, spewing forth hordes of Slaad, or the environment itself could start to warp and twist.
It's a great way to introduce an element of randomness and unpredictability into a campaign, keep those players on their toes.
Okay, last but not least, we have the Kyton, a creature that perfectly blends gothic horror with aerial combat prowess.
Kytons are like something straight out of a dark fairy tale. They have these stag-like bodies, bird wings, and a disturbing hunger for hearts.
And their aerial attacks can be really difficult to counter, especially for parties that are used to fighting on the ground.
They're a great way to add a vertical element to combat and create a truly memorable encounter.
I can see how incorporating a Kyton into a campaign could really up the creepy factor.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Exploring those creatures that might not be as well known as the classics, but have the potential to add so much depth and excitement to your D&D games.
This has been a great overview of these underappreciated creatures. So what do you say we take a closer look at some of their specific abilities and discuss how we can effectively use them in our campaigns?
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive deeper. Welcome back. So we've talked about all these cool, underrated monsters, but how do we actually use them in our games?
Right, like knowing about a monster is one thing, but weaving it into a campaign in a way that feels both challenging and rewarding, that's the real art.
It's about finding that sweet spot, where you surprise your players, make them think on their feet, but you're not just throwing impossible encounters at them for the sake of it.
Exactly. So where do we even start? Let's go back to the rust monster. You mentioned their metal-eating abilities, but how do we use that effectively without just completely ruining a party's day?
Foreshadowing. That's the key. You don't want to just spring a rust monster on them out of nowhere. Plant some seeds. Maybe they hear rumors from villagers like, oh, there are these strange creatures in the mines that devour metal, or they find a tattered scroll detailing the dangers of a certain area.
So give them a chance to prepare, right?
Yeah.
Maybe invest in some non-metallic weapons or armor.
Exactly. It creates that sense of anticipation, that dread, like something's out there that can really mess us up if we're not careful. And when they do finally encounter that rust monster, the tension is so much higher.
It becomes a much more satisfying encounter for everyone involved, and it gives the players a chance to really shine, show off their creative problem-solving skills.
Speaking of creative challenges, let's talk about those chaotic quicklings. Their speed can make for some really dynamic combat, but how do we keep those encounters from feeling repetitive or frustrating for the players?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because if every Quickling encounter is just a blur of attacks that are impossible to hit, it's going to lose its impact pretty quickly.
Totally agree. So think about using their speed in more interesting ways. Not just for overwhelming attacks, maybe they're using their speed to steal something, to set traps, to create diversions.
So it becomes less about brute force and more about a battle of wits.
Exactly. Keeps the players on their toes, makes them think strategically, and don't forget their fey nature. Quicklings are mischievous, unpredictable, maybe they're not even hostile, just really annoying pranksters even.
Oh, I can see that leading to some hilarious moments at the table, especially if they manage to outsmart the players and get away with something valuable.
It's all about creating memorable moments, right? And that brings us to the Revenant. Now, we talked about how they can be more than just mindless killing machines. How do we use their backstory, their motivations, to create a truly compelling encounter?
Yeah, because every Revenant has that unfinished business, right? A powerful desire for revenge, a quest for justice, a lingering attachment to something or someone they lost. It's like a built-in storyline.
It is. And that backstory is pure gold for a DM. You can weave it into the campaign, drop clues, have the players encounter people who knew the Revenant in life, really build up that context.
So when the players finally meet the Revenant, It's not just a random monster, it's a character with a history, with emotions, with a purpose.
And that opens up so many possibilities. It becomes a role-playing opportunity. Maybe the players can reason with the Revenant and help it find peace. Or maybe they have to make a tough choice, like destroying it to protect others.
It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the encounter, and that's what makes it so memorable.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From the depths of emotion to the chilling world of the Chain Devil, these creatures are masters of manipulation, of torment. How do we translate that into a truly terrifying encounter?
For me, it's all about those chains. But not just as weapons. It's the psychological impact, the feeling of being restrained, helpless, controlled.
That sense of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of something truly malevolent, that's what makes Chain Devil so scary.
Exactly. And think about the environment. A dungeon with chains hanging from the ceiling, or a chamber with a pit in the center, just waiting for someone to fall in.
Oh, yeah, the environment is key. And don't forget the sound. The rattling of chains in the darkness can be so unsettling.
It creates this atmosphere of dread, like something terrible's about to happen.
And you can play with that dread. Maybe the Chain Devil doesn't attack right away. It toys with the players, uses its chains to manipulate the environment, separate the party, dangle a helpless captive in front of them.
Oh, that's just cruel, but so effective. It makes the players feel like they're constantly on edge, never knowing what's going to happen next.
It's all about creating that tension, that sense of unease. And from the chains of the Chain Devil, we ascend to the mind-bending power of the Aboleth. How do we handle these ancient psionic beings without making the players feel like they're just pawns in a cosmic game they can't win?
Aboleths are tricky, that's for sure. They're so powerful, so manipulative. It's easy to go overboard and make them feel like unstoppable forces of nature.
Right, but we don't want the players to feel hopeless. So it's all about subtlety, about mystery. You don't want to reveal the Aboleth right away. Instead, drop hints, subtle clues that something is amiss.
So it becomes a detective story almost. The players are piecing together the clues, trying to figure out what's going on before it's too late.
Exactly. And the stakes are high because Aboleths, they have big plans, They might be trying to corrupt an entire region, enslave a population, reshape the world to their liking.
That's a level of intrigue that could really sustain a campaign. This hidden puppet master pulling strings from the shadows.
It's a classic storytelling trope for a reason. Now, from the manipulation of the Aboleth, let's dive into the pure chaos of the Slaad. How do we translate that unpredictable, ever-changing nature of Limbo into a fun and engaging encounter?
Slaads are all about randomness.
Right.
So how do we embrace that without just making things feel completely arbitrary?
Honestly, don't overthink it. Don't try to plan every detail. Let the dice decide what type of Slaad the players encounter. Be ready to improvise, roll with the punches.
So it's about reacting to the situation as it unfolds, rather than sticking to a rigid plan.
Exactly. That's what makes Slaad encounters so dynamic, so much fun. It keeps everyone on their toes, both the players and the DM.
It also reflects the nature of Limbo itself, which is constantly in flux. So how do we incorporate that visually, spatially?
Portals, man. Portals opening and closing, spewing forth different types of Slaad. Or maybe the environment itself starts to warp and twist, reflecting that chaotic energy.
Oh, that's cool. It creates this sense of disorientation, like the players are truly stepping outside the boundaries of the familiar world.
Exactly. It makes the encounter so much more immersive, so much more memorable. Okay, last but not least, those heart-hungry peritons. How do we tap into their creepy factor and make them more than just a flying annoyance?
For me, it's all about the atmosphere. Peritons are predators, but they're also intelligent, cunning. So they might stalk the party for days, observing their movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Oh, that's creepy. And so effective. It plays on that primal fear of being hunted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And use the environment to your advantage. A forest at dusk, long shadows, the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. It sets the stage for a truly chilling encounter.
Yeah, and don't forget their hunger for hearts. It adds a visceral element to the encounter. It's not just about killing for food, it's about something darker.
That makes the stakes so much higher, so much more personal.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about tactics, strategies, ways to create truly memorable and engaging encounters using these awesome, underrated monsters.
And the beauty of it is, these are just starting points. You can take these ideas and run with them, adapt them to your own campaign, your own style, your own twisted imagination.
The possibilities are endless. So, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to give a shout out to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello for the fantastic article that inspired this deep dive.
Absolutely. It's a treasure trove of information for any DM looking to add some spice to their games.
Definitely check it out. Now, for those of you listening, we have a final thought-provoking question for you to consider.
We've talked about how using these less common monsters can shake things up, make your campaigns more dynamic. But what if, instead of focusing on the monsters themselves, we focused on the reactions of the players?
Ooh, interesting angle. You're talking about the psychological impact, the emotional responses that these encounters evoke.
Exactly. How do their characters react to facing something truly unexpected? Something that challenges their assumptions about the world?
It's a whole other level of role-playing. It's about exploring the human element, the emotional core of what makes these games so compelling.
So, as we move on to the final part of our deep dive, keep that question in mind. How can we, as DMs, use these underrated monsters to create not just challenging encounters, but truly memorable experiences for our players?
I can't wait to explore that further. There's so much more to uncover.
So we've talked about how awesome these underrated monsters are and how they can really shake things up in a campaign. But I'm curious, why do you think these creatures are so often overlooked in the first place?
That's a good question. I mean, there are literally thousands of monsters in D&D. Why do some get all the glory while others just fade into obscurity?
I think, for me, part of it might be just the comfort of familiarity. You know, dragons, beholders, goblins, these are the classics, the ones we all know and love.
Yeah, there's that nostalgia factor, right? It's like comfort food. You know what to expect. It's familiar.
Exactly. But, like we've been saying, sticking with the familiar all the time, it can get stale.
Yeah.
You know, it's like if you eat the same meal every day, eventually it's not going to be as satisfying.
Totally. You need variety, you need spice, you need those unexpected flavors to keep things interesting, and that's what these underrated monsters bring to the table.
They shake things up, force the players to think creatively, to adapt, to maybe even reevaluate their whole approach to the game.
Exactly. And you know, it's not just about the challenge, it's about the story potential too. Like the Aboleth with their psionic powers and their ancient history, that's a whole campaign arc right there.
Or the Revenant, driven by revenge, seeking justice. There's so much emotional depth you can explore there. So many opportunities for role-playing and moral dilemmas.
It's about using these monsters as more than just stat blocks, you know? They can be characters in their own right, with their own motivations, their own stories, and that's what makes them so compelling.
And it all circles back to that question we posed earlier. How can we use these creatures to create truly memorable experiences for our players? Experiences that go beyond just rolling dice and killing monsters.
It's about getting into the heads of your players and their characters. What are their fears? What motivates them? What kind of choices would really challenge them?
Imagine, a scenario where the players have to confront a revenant that was once their friend or their mentor.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not just a fight. That's a gut-wrenching decision.
Yeah.
Do they destroy this being that they once cared about, or do they try to find another way?
Exactly. And those are the kind of moments that stick with players long after the session is over.
And it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that. Even something like a rust monster can create a really powerful moment if it destroys something meaningful to a character. Not just their weapons or armor, but maybe a family heirloom or a gift from a loved one.
The loss becomes personal. And that can really affect a character's motivations and actions moving forward.
It's all about creating those moments of emotional resonance, those moments that make the game truly come alive.
So, to wrap things up, I want to encourage everyone listening to think outside the box when it comes to choosing monsters for your campaigns.
Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper into the monster manual. Explore those lesser-known creatures. You might be surprised at what you find.
There's a whole world of possibilities out there just waiting to be discovered. And who knows, you might even find your party's new favorite adversary or ally.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy gaming.
And may your encounters be memorable.